Well, I have to thank all of you for doing this, because I think, firstly, I like the venue and I like the fact that you're doing this, and so congratulations. So I'll just go through a bit of a story. I hope that's okay with you. I'll try to speak slowly. Sometimes I get too excited and I speak too quickly, but I will try not to. Anyway, so really, why, what, and how? And funnily enough, I'm not a bureaucrat, which is quite interesting, but I've worked with bureaucrats all my life, and I've discovered, of course, that many of them are extremely interesting. So the two words, as our friend just said, coming together is like an oxymoron. Bureaucracy sounds boring. Creativity, in theory, interesting. And this tension, of course, we want to solve, because what it's really saying is public administrators are also quite interesting. It's just that they're sometimes trapped in systems. So what we're trying to do is recapture, as it says here, those positive values that were always historically part of a bureaucracy. And once it was seen as benign and modern. So, there are lots of words here, don't worry about it, but many good people with many positive values and good intentions who are competent have made choices to work in the public interest, but somehow the structures does something and the good ideas fade away, and that is for many reasons that you obviously know about. Now, also, we know the urgency. I calculated the days until the 1st of January 2030. And of course, we got COP in Sharm el-Sheikh just now, today. And then I calculated the days until January 1950. And so this gives us a deadline, and a deadline is always quite helpful to have. And we all know the massive changes that are going on. I don't need to elaborate them. But putting it simply, this is the cover of one of my books, and this crack in the middle we need to solve. We all know that we're in the midst of I suppose, a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach will not get us to where we need to be, because our economic order and way of life is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. So many people, and probably many of you, most of you in this room, have all woken up already, but we all need to wake up in some sense. And of course, the pandemic was just one variation of this waking up. And a friend of mine who just lives 8 kilometers away, every few weeks he puts a word up in front of where he lives, and instead of lockdown, he put luckdown. But I prefer to take a picture with a bit of sun and blue sky, because I think to some extent there is an opportunity in the crisis, because it's made us perhaps rethink again. And of course, the big issue, and there are many, many, many big issues, but one of the central ones, of course, is our hubris has been humbled. And crisis, of course, is a time for deep rethinking. And one of the things is that we recognize, I think, perhaps, that our civilization is a thin film of order that we build around the chaos of events. And because of that, many people are, of course, looking at their cities and the places, and perhaps trying to blend in nature together again, respect nature, and so on. So pioneering cities obviously are thinking about the future in many ways. I think practically every city. But one of the things we recognize is, of course, the fragility, that everything can fall apart so easy, which is why I think this creative bureaucracy Prague idea, for example, is so significant. And some people say it's 1 minute before midnight. So of course, we need a plan B. This is a planning organization in Ghent in Belgium, but anyway, they've got a good name, Plan B. And many people have got this Plan B. This is the We Make the City event in Amsterdam that happens, and you can already see the words on this slide. Vibrant city, of course, but circular economy. You can see these words here, inclusive, people-driven smartness, healthy cities, all the words that we all know about. So these are the things we're trying to achieve, and the question is, are the incentives and regulations such that we can achieve them? And of course, all of that is in the context of the massive breakthrough that we all know about, which is the digitizing world, which makes it a smaller place, but also makes us understand better the interconnections between things. And so I know you're talking about digitization tomorrow, a lot of it. And of course, this handshake between the good feedback loops that we can create, obviously we need data sovereignty, all of these issues that I know you've discussed, because we know we can't hide from big data, but at least we should control it rather than someone else. Now, what I've always been thinking about, and I'm sure you have too, is what shifts systems. And when I wrote The Creative City a long, long, long time ago, the book, I always talked about crisis, the way crisis can do things. And you know, in Chinese, crisis is problem and opportunity. That's what the word means in Chinese, at least. So crisis is one thing. The other is concepts, having concepts. 35 years ago or 50 years ago, when the Club of Rome report came out in '72, it talked about sustainability. That was a concept that drove things. There are other concepts, you know, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. So concepts can drive things. And then missions, you all know about the EU's, there's mission-oriented development they're doing, Mariana Mazzucato, which is basically saying, I want to get there, and I want it to be nearly achievable, but it's got to be ambitious, it's got to challenge me, and so on. So missions. And then principles. Obviously principles, I don't know, empower people, etc. is a principle. And then an evolving mood. And I think there is an evolving mood. An evolving mood has happened that we do need to think and plan and act differently. And so when that comes together, sometimes you may shift a system. Now, the argument that I'm making, or we made, or the creative bureaucracy is about, is it's a clarion call, a trumpet call to think afresh, to just sort of empty your mind and think, hey, what the hell can we do? And within that, our main aim is essentially to unleash the talent that exists everywhere, if the conditions are right. Secondly, to connect you, if you are public administrators, better to the outside world. And three, to attract new talent to bureaucracies. If bureaucracies are boring, horrible places where you think you can't express yourself and it's like hell, of course you'll say, I'll go to an internet company that gives me more money, given that I've heard yesterday that someone who's high up in a bureaucracy gets the same as a bus driver, even though they've had a master's degree in Oxford or somewhere else. So these are obviously issues that one needs to address. But the key thing, and this is easy to say, as it says on this slide here, we need to move from a no-because culture to a yes-if. Easy to say, I know. But too often we say, no, because, rather than, yes, if you thought about it like this, then perhaps we could actually achieve something, etc. Now, I'm not pretending that the bureaucracy is everything. That's crazy, of course. But without one, not much can work. I mean, you know, red lights. I'm very pleased that red lights mean stop and not go, things like that, etc., etc. So the desire of the notion and the idea is really, lots of people say that the middle in an organization, level 3, 4, 5, etc., 6, is frozen because they are scared and frightened. Now, there's been some research by Harvard, some professor in Harvard, looking over the years at innovations in bureaucracy, and actually discovered that many of the innovations that occur happen from within that middle, as distinct from that middle being, you know, negative and not really, you know, just blocking things. So that's one thing that we're really interested in highlighting and focusing on. Now, of course, typically we think, if you use the word creative, You think creative artists, creative scientists, business people, social innovators, hipsters, and all of that. We think of that. However, in fact, rarely is the public administration put in that box. But they're dealing with mobility, they're dealing with welfare, parks, safety, children, diversity, etc., etc. So they've obviously got to have something in their mind to make all of that happen. Now, the critique, we know, and of course there is critique, nobody's pretending this is all wonderful, and the critique is the endless frustration people have. They've got energy, you know, they decided to work in these institutions and then their energy fades away because they're so frustrated. And you know the English word red tape, there's too much complexity, there's not a straight line, I say something, I can do it, etc., etc. If I want to speak to someone in another department, I have to go up there and down there rather than horizontally across. And then, of course, the silo. We all know about the silo. Now, that's not to say that people in their specialism, we'd still agree that people should have specialisms, but in fact, what's more important is horizontally coming across to the others and collaborating, because 1 + 1 may equal 3. And of course, the other criticism is that there's too much paper, you know, it's just paper, paper, paper. These are some of the environmental policies of Paris just lining out on a table, but you get the point I'm trying to make. And what I think happens often, the administration often recruits the brightest people, but trains them to conform. And in their private life, they often live this agile world that so many people are talking about, where flexibility, etc., is demanded. Now, I'm not going to go through the history of bureaucracy, but I'll just remind you of some names. You know, Max Weber, the iron cage of the bureaucracy, but also talked about transparency and accountability. Then the whole thing that happened in the 80s onwards, new public management, only business knows how things work. We need to learn from them and do what they say. Then new public governance, which went a bit further and said public-private partnerships. Perhaps we both have something to say to each other. Then new public service, which is basically saying, I am serving the citizen. That's the internal logic of that form of, let's say, bureaucratic action. And then, obviously, open governance. So these are just 5 stages in this trajectory. Now, you don't need to read all this because you can have this PowerPoint, so there's no problem. These are some initiatives. The Digitale Stadt in Amsterdam, 1993, Place Lab at MIT, Mind Lab, the first public innovation entity, national one in Denmark, Vinnova in Sweden, Citra in Finland, Forum Virium in Helsinki, the Living Labs movement, OPSI is the Office of Public Sector Innovation at OECD, etc., 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 etc. So to some extent, our aim, and you in Prague are so part of it, is if we can bring these together, not be competitive, but just say, we are promoting all of you, we agree that many of the things you do, we can create a sort of movement in the making. So this is just a picture of the first Creative Bureaucracy Festival, where we all had our scarves, and it all said creative bureaucrat, you were one, you were one, you were one, and you wandered around as a creative bureaucrat. And this is just one example of the stage that we had there. So one of the interesting questions is, we're obviously trying to shift the organizational culture and the culture of management. And one thing is interesting, we gave a prize to the humble governance approach of Finland and particularly Helsinki, where you don't say, I know exactly what's happening when you're developing a policy. You change it as you get responses. So in education, if your kids are saying, this is really boring the way you're teaching and stuff like that, you change it within the process of doing. Interesting, look it up. But also perhaps think like a startup. So another desire that we have is to create a situation where people say, you are not alone. And in a sense, you gathering here proves that you are not alone, because they're probably, I hope, broadly you're on the same wavelength. And at the last festival in Berlin in June, there were 10 people from Israeli ministries, and then we had a Zoom later, and then they said this was like collective psychotherapy, because they suddenly saw another 800 people who seemed to be thinking like them, etc. So it's building not only a better bureaucracy and creating another bureaucracy, it's trying to create something that operates perhaps on different principles. Now, one key thing you know when you're doing something is it doing it the right way, as it says in this sort of document that you have, and you perhaps have documents, half a meter worth of documents, or is it doing the right thing? Which means that sometimes you have to go against what the institution says. Or, put it another way, lawyers here will know that, is it the letter of the law as written there at some point, or the spirit of that law, its intention at that time? So these are sort of some of the questions to ask. Do we want a different culture or a different structure? Often the structure could be exactly the same as long as the culture in that structure is different. Another way of putting it, and I'm sorry there are so many words here, but I just thought normally I wouldn't have so many words, I'd have more pictures, but just, you know, is we need to move from a known and predict and provide model. This is what we need to do and this is how it will happen, to elastic planning, where we're strategically principled. We know the big aims. We will be a place that empowers people, for example. That is non-negotiable, but tactically flexible in how we implement it. And what this is all about, of course, is harnessing the collective intelligence and perhaps also learning what other organization types do, which may be better than what you do. So that leaves us with this simple sentence. Often when people say, I have a vision, they say, I have a vision, but what are the rules? And the rules are defined, or the vision defined within the rules, rather than reframing it and saying the opposite. The vision shapes the rules rather than the rules shape the vision. Again, easy to say, difficult to do. Now, if I'm thinking of this future bureaucrat, and I'm thinking of you, I'm looking at you in this audience, and I'm thinking about what characteristics you have, and generally it's about openness, clearly, but it's having a mindset that is able to be divergent, open, as I say, not 24/7, but basically more open than closed, but then also knowing when to be convergent, to draw in and say we need to act and so on. Secondly, that this future bureaucrat needs to be foresight-driven, focused on the future in some sense, what are the future problems, and be able to think in an integrated way, which means overcoming silos. And then emotional intelligence. In the book we wrote, and if you give me all your emails, I can send you the PDF of this book, The Creative Bureaucracy, we talk about the warm organization. An organization that is warm rather than cold obviously achieves much more. So that's what we mean by emotional intelligence. And then in terms of skills, I've mentioned this already, this knowledge of generic skills, communication is a generic skill, plus the technical skill that someone may have. And finally, obviously, a more collaborative working process. Now, one of the things we all know is we need routine and predictability. So I'm not saying every routine should be thrown up in the air, but routines can be reassessed. How do I, in the library, manage books coming in or out? Can be all rethought, for example. So we understand that there's the need for routine. And as I've already said, the thing about the silo and collaboration. And thirdly, often in working, there's multidisciplinary working. You get the environmental person, the social affairs person, etc., in a room, urban planning, and you say, what makes a great street? And they say, according to my rules, this is it, this, as distinct from interdisciplinary working, where you say, hey, what's your definition of a great street? How do you change what you're doing to create collectively a great street? I'm just using that as an example. So in a sense, this is just a summary. What we're seeing is trying to revalue the public interest as a vocation, as a positive vocation, shifting the image of what a public administration is from being dull and boring to more interesting, and attracting the young to reshape what the bureaucracy is about. Then the pillars, the three pillars, is rethinking the regulations and incentives, reshaping the inner life, this warm organization, and creating trust via links to other organizational types. And then the three goals, obviously, is create a better world, address the global issues, decarbonization, help create more livable, fairer places, and so on. That's all obvious. So this is interesting. This is a Russian piece of art. But anyway, it's quite interesting because it says, in a way, in a picture, we need to rethink rules and regulations. Now, of course, I'm aware, and you're aware, that this requires courage. It isn't easy because it involves sort of pushing against boundaries at times. But I think that a group of people like you who are represented in this room, of course, bring stuff. You bring, of course, your incredible knowledge, your energy, all of these things into the situation. And I'll just give a few examples before I finish. This is Adelaide, where we did a major study on this. They, for example, the Premier, the Prime Minister, allowed something which was called the 90-day project. You as a bureaucrat could say, I've got a big problem, we need to solve it in 90 days. A citizen could say, we need to solve it in 90 days. We can discuss this in the workshop later if you want. But basically, this unleashed power because you had a deadline. And some of these problems actually were solvable by just bringing people around the table and having a conversation and having a room where they all meet. Often it's as simple as that. Another example is Bologna, and you all know, well, perhaps you know or don't know, I don't know, the Bologna Declaration of 2014 about the urban commons, where people collectively, citizens groups and so on, with the city begin to manage parks and various facilities and so on. Or here, Restaurant Day in Finland, Helsinki, where these tech-savvy Finns said, it's so difficult to set up a restaurant. So they, 6-7 years ago, connected through the internet and said, on this day, the 15th of May, we will set up all these restaurants on the street. And they all came up. And the mayor and others said, this is forbidden, isn't it? And then someone pointed out that the vision of Helsinki was to have a vibrant, blah-de-blah place with energy and so on, so that they shifted the rules to enable that to happen. Or here, obviously, you all know about the 15-minute city, which has become a big thing, or the 1-minute city, 5-minute city, which is about localizing things. Or carbon trading at the city level. The first was Lahti, L-A-H-T-I, in Finland, that did carbon trading. So if you didn't use your car, you got gifts and rewards, just as an example, all done through tech. Or this project, which you know, which is Parking Day, which was set up by a San Francisco design company, and suddenly it spread around the world, where you just occupy a car park. But the first one they did, the guy said in San Francisco, he put 4 hours in and put some chairs and started on a sofa. And the parking attendant said, what the hell are you doing? This is for cars. He said, no, I've rented the space that you have here. Now, just that simple idea became, again, another movement of Parking Day. You could look it up. So we're near the end. So in our festival, we sometimes have fuck-up nights. I mean, you probably know the Berlin airport took 10 years more than people wanted. Nevertheless, this is just the guy who was the head of that organization, describing what the fuck up was. And we also then acknowledge heroes and heroines of the movement. These are just 3 people who we acknowledge from Mexico, Germany, and Denmark. And of course, this is the cliche, it's all about the next generation. And this is the daughter of the General Secretary of Eurocities. And she has one of these creative bureaucrat scarves on. So I saw this little thing in Krakow. I'm free again. So it is about liberation in some sense. So thank you very much.